Wisteria, energy, twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Encyclopedia of Fairies. We're now on fairy courts, and again, when we say fairy courts, it's hard to not think of Tinkerbell, I know. Everybody's in fairy with Tinkerbell, but fairy courts is just a word for a number of beings, not just one being. It's various beings, and basically the fairy courts are more complicated than one might think. The reason they are given the Seelie and the Unseelie name is because it was just a way that we could then interpret good from bad. It's very, very simple. I mean, the courts of the fairies are very similar to the British courts monarchy. You know, they have king or queen or both, but they have everything in them, all the way down to servants, you know, and those who attend animals and crops. It's not about a very small group of fairies. It's about a very large group of beings, one being the Seelie, the good ones, and the other being the Unseelie, the bad. Because we're positive, there has to be negative and vice versa. So it's really hard to determine the courts, especially the fairy courts, because we're not looking at just a few beings and one particular being. We're looking at a whole cast of many different beings. So it's very complicated, and it does work much like the courts that are in royalty. And, you know, there's lots of different people in those courts. There's lots of different beings in those courts, right from the bottom all the way to the top. So when we look at fairy courts, it's kind of hard not to sit and think, oh, king or queen, and then maybe a few knights. But it's not like that. It's very intricate and goes into really big detail. So just think of it more as a monarchy, a kingdom in itself, I suppose, working with many different beings, where you get everything from the maids right to the workers to the king or the queen. That's what an actual fairy court is. And the Seelie and Unseelie, those names came in. The Unseelie is meant to be bad and the Seelie is meant to be good. But that's just to differ good from evil, as there always is in many folklore and things. And then we have fairy doors. Fairy doors are not as old as what you think. The origin of fairy doors, it traces to Ann Arbor, Michigan, early 1990s. Although they didn't start appearing in random public places until 2005. That is how recent fairy doors are. Originally, the idea of the illustrator Jonathan Wright, the fairy doors began as artwork. It should be noted, though, Wright did move on, and he actually hosts his own website of urban fairies. He's a fairyologist. But the initial concept was aimed at children, created by Wright to delight and encourage belief in his wife's preschool students. One can now purchase them from a variety of special companies, as well as mass market catalogues. They also feature in work of different artists and can be seen in museums, public parks. Some fairy doors open up to tiny rooms, rather like dolls' houses, and the implication is that these are where fairies live. Others are simply doors placed against flat surfaces, kind of replicate a fairy door. But you can see them in paintings. In fact, you can see them pretty much anywhere, fairy doors, but they are fairly new. They are not an old folklore thing. They are of the 1990s. That to me is fairly recent. It's not something that's very old. Then we have fairy familiars. And among those people who are known to have regular contact with fairies, there are some who might be said to have a fairy familiar. Unlike the more well-known demonic familiar, the fairy familiar was not purely associated with witches, but with cunning folk, wise women, and some regular people who simply had a reputation for associating with fair folk. In some cases, a Lianatana Sihi might act as a fairy familiar. These familiars were fairy beings, often former humans, who had a connection to a living person and acted as a go-between for human and fairy beings more generally. A woman named Ketty Rourke in Ireland had such a human turned fairy friend, a man who she had known when he was alive and who was thought to have drowned, but would come to her among the fairies and give her advice. Also, Bessie Dunlop's fairy familiar was a fun mortal named Tom, who was a distant relative of Bessie's. In appearance, the fairy familiar would look like a human being, although they were noted to often wear green, and sometimes black or white. They were also seen by other people besides the person to whom they were attached, although in some cases, such as Yeats, a friend of the fairies, there may be specific limitations on who else can see the actual fairy. These beings are described as tangible. They're able to give physical objects to humans and directly influence the human world. Those who saw and interacted with them did so, in many instances, during the day while wide awake, so you couldn't say it was a dream. A person might gain a fairy familiar after being away with the fairies for a period of time, perhaps during an illness, or have such a, familiar given to them by a family member, or a more powerful fairy such as the Queen. These spirits acted as go-betweens with the person and fairies, gave knowledge of healing skills and acted as guardians for the witch, in some cases granting the witch special powers of foresight, or a second sight. In some cases, they also acted to punish the human if the person transgressed against the will of the good people or offended them in some way. Yeats told of a woman he was acquainted with whose mother had a friend among the good people, a being who may be perhaps categorized as a fairy familiar. This fairy woman was seen by the girl who witnessed the fairy visiting her mother, but told Yeats that her mother's fairy friend was never seen by any man, only women. It's unclear why this prohibition was in place, but the woman recounted how she had once tried to bring her father to see the fairy to prove the fairy woman existed, only to have her disappear before he could see her, and the fairy woman was quite angry at this attempt. That's from 1888. So yeah, fairy familiars don't always come in an animal form. They can come in spirits, basically. That's what they're on about. They're on about human spirits. And that's why some people have the beliefs that there is us and then there is them. Us being the humans, them being everything else, such as the aliens, the spirits, all fae. Just different types of fae, maybe in different categories. Obviously, then there's people that actually say, no, the human spirits. But there's a lot of belief that the fairies act as a human spirit, and they're just the go-between between our world and their world, So it is very possible they could be either of those things. It's one of those ideas where you believe what you want. It's your choice, Nobody can force you to believe anything. But do research because there's some interesting points to be made on that. Thank you for listening to this episode and many blessings.
Wisteria. Energy. Twister.